All right, we're in the last week of our series about spiritual disciplines called resolution because we want to use these spiritual practices that we're talking about as new ways to connect with God this year. Instead of whatever New Year's resolution you failed at already, the idea is to make these spiritual practices our resolution, right? And they also help us to see God more clearly and see ourselves more clearly, aka better resolution. I was trying to be clever. It's like a semi-clever dad joke. So it's all good. I've been saying for the last month or so that in this series that it really is true. We don't engage in spiritual disciplines because we want to seem extra spiritual or because there's treasures in heaven about it, right? Or because of it. The reason that we want to engage in some of these spiritual disciplines is because the point of all of them in different ways is to connect us with God. And the thing that I hope that you see after we've gone through some of these very different practices, things that look very different from each other, is that they all help us in different ways bring ourselves before the God of the universe and direct us to following Jesus instead of following whatever hurt, habit, or hang up that usually direct our steps. Now, you can find any of those weeks on YouTube. My hope is that you know that regardless of whatever we're talking about, be it meditation, be it fasting, or worshiping, or gratitude, or any others that we've discussed, they point us to the path that Jesus is walking. Now, we are all called to follow, and that's the true meaning of discipleship. That's what that means. That's what we are doing, is following Jesus. And these spiritual practices are ways that we can go and take steps in that following. Instead of this of spiritual disciplines as something that only a certain type of extra spiritual person does, hopefully as we've talked about them, recontextualized that one, we see what these might actually look like in our lives, and two, we've demonstrated that they're meant to actually make us different than we are before. We aren't doing these spiritual disciplines because we think that they feel good or we feel like we've done our spiritual duty for the day. Instead, we're talking about we do these because they have fruit in our lives. They actually lead us to being different than we have been before. This isn't because the church is trying to turn you into someone that you're not, but because we are all imperfect this side of heaven. We believe that God is still active and moving in our own lives, and we as followers of Jesus are seeking to, you guessed it, follow. But to follow means we actually have to do some moving. So if you've ever known someone, maybe you've known somebody like this, or maybe you've been this person as well. You know, they come to church for a while, and they quit coming to worship on Sundays because guess what? Them showing up once a week and maybe to a class every once in a while with the expectation that just everything's going to get fixed. Like, well, it didn't work. Church didn't take. Well, the reason that happened, the reason that they didn't experience transformation is because they're doing all the things that they've done before outside of the times that they're in this building. If your life looks 100% the same outside of this building that it did before when you spent any time in here worshiping God, then it's going to be then you're going to deal with the same brokenness that you were. The whole point of what we do in here is to help you with what you're doing out there. It's to equip you for living your life out there in a way of following God. My friend Pastor John from Hope Elam likes to say, if you want to go somewhere you've never gone, you have to do some things you've never done before. No, he didn't make that up, but that's something that he likes to say a lot. And think of spiritual disciplines as the method by which we move a little bit differently throughout the world. We can see if we get some different results. And I said this last week, but it's important enough to say again. So many of us love the goal of being who God made us to be. We don't always love the process of being who God made us to be. And there are a couple of different ways to be formed into God. One of those ways is to experience a lot of hardship, to experience some things that really hurt and let God move through those things, and undoubtedly that's a part of life this side of heaven. Another way to be formed is to move intentionally with God, and that's what spiritual disciplines are moving intentionally with God so that you might see more where God is leading. That's why these spiritual disciplines are important. They are the process by which we can achieve this, try to achieve this goal this side of heaven, being the man that God made us to be. None of us are perfect, but God is continuing to lead us in that. This is put very simply, this is the doing stuff. You're like, I want to do some stuff. This is it. We can have as much mental feng shui as we want, where we try to have the perfect theology or the perfect, we follow the right pastors online. We feel that we listen to the right music so we sound extra spiritual. Whatever we want to do, that's totally great. But if that doesn't lead to any fruit in our lives, then what is it actually for? Is it just another thing to make us feel better? That's not what faith is. Jesus came and died and was, spoiler alert, resurrected to give us new life. So take some steps in the process. And you might ask, like, what do we have left? What could we possibly have as a spiritual discipline that we haven't talked about already? It's one of the most important ones because you could do all the ones before, right? You could set timers each day to bring yourself before God in all these ways that we've talked about, and even maybe gain some really great spiritual insight and feel connected to the vine and still feel really disconnected to people around you because you feel like something's missing. This is because we're not meant to do it alone. Our last spiritual discipline that we're going to talk about is fellowship. We've talked before about the loneliness pandemic. We've mentioned this before, but it's a good reminder just in case you haven't heard it or need a refresher. The number one ideal circumstance for manhood is that you are the one guy at the top that can do it, being the only guy that can do what needs to be done. You're the one who can get the job done, and you don't need anyone else's help, or somehow that cheapens the achievement somehow. You see this all the time in movies, and I'm not saying anything against these movies. I happen to enjoy every single one of these immensely. Top Gun, Top Gun 2, The Matrix, Die Hard, John Wick, the Bourne movies. Notice what all of these movies have in common. Raise your hand if you've seen any of those movies. Yeah, yeah. So you know what I'm saying, right? Some of these characters find themselves in a position where they want some help, even maybe, but they go, well, I guess I'm the only one who can do it, right? That's what that ends up being the point of these movies, is that they are the only ones that are going to be able to get it done. And we celebrate them because in the end, they alone were the best. This idea even translates to sports, right? When you hear, I listen to a lot of sports podcasts, different things, and a lot of times the GOAT conversation comes up, the greatest of all time. If you're in basketball, what's the main argument? Is it Jordan or is it LeBron? Who's the greatest of all time? The LeBron crowd's calmed down a little bit because it's not looked good the last couple of years. But if it's football, is Tom Brady the best? The answer is yes. But the point is that the thing that people come back to that highlight the reason I bring this up in our conversation this morning is people say, well, that year doesn't count. Why? Because they had help. Oh, well, that year they had a stacked team. He's not the best ever because he had help. Do you notice how just inherently how it's so built into us? Well, to be the greatest means that you have to be completely alone. Ideally, you are alone at the top. Well, I have a slide for that even. We're supposed to be at the top alone because you alone can do it. But notice, guys, we don't do that well. We are going to be alone and not at the top, which is where a lot of us might find ourselves someday, where we think we're supposed to be the only ones, but because we don't get to the top, we're somewhere below the top and still alone. And that leads to some pretty bleak things. Men make up of 50% of the population, but in 2021 made up 80% of suicide attempts. A lot of times we think that that's a sad. We think those are suicide's depicted as a thing of depressed teenagers, or something along those lines with that demographic, with youths that are troubled. But the biggest age demographic in danger of suicide, the two biggest age demographics we could put together: men 34 through 54, and 75 and older. Is the number one kind of group of people. Those two demographics are, I get, the 1 and 2 most in danger of suicide. Men 34 through 54 and 75 and older. I know that hits a whole bunch of us in this room. And guess what? If you're in between there, you're not last. You're just right behind that in statistics. And I'm not going to pretend to know how to interpret that information, right? But you can make some inferences that there are some pretty serious instances of desperation based on feeling alone. Only a quarter of men in a recent survey, I've given you a lot of statistics about this before. Here's a new one. A recent survey went out, only a quarter of guys can list at least 6 friends. Only a quarter of guys could list 6 people they would consider their friend, which is half of what it was 30 years ago. The same survey happened 30 years ago. It was double the amount of people. We are becoming more alone. And that's by design of the way that things have happened. People becoming more isolated online. People becoming more isolated in communities. This ideal of the single alone guy that is going to be at the top. We have grown isolated. I'm not talking about this because it's sad. It is. But I'm also talking about it because it's against what God has designed for us. It is completely in the face of the way that we are created and what is articulated in the Bible. God made us to live together in community. Think about this for a second. We're entering a week where we're talking about the last week of Jesus' life, as we know it before the resurrection. Sorry, spoiler alert in case anybody didn't know that whole piece of it. Something that is highlighted is that the interaction with his disciples throughout the process. That's a big part of the story in Scripture. And something that becomes very clear, and I would encourage you to come to the Holy Week services to get the whole story. The disciples constantly and royally mess it up. Make a lot of mistakes through the whole process. They are unfailingly loyal until everything breaks down, right? One of them betrays Jesus to those conspiring to kill him. Another denies even knowing him 3 times, and many of them are absent as he dies a horrific death, running away scared. And I'm not trying to I'm not trying to jump to Easter, but even after the resurrection and subsequent transcendence of Jesus, those people, those disciples, all of those people who abandoned him when it got hard, all of those people are put in charge of the church after Jesus ascends. If you're in HR, you're like performance management. What is that? This is the best that we could get. Those guys are the ones who are trusted to lead the birth of a church, and it can leave us wondering, why bother with all of that? So many of us grew up with a gospel story that it just kind of feels kind of inevitable. It's totally not. Jesus didn't need disciples, right? God didn't need to include anyone else. Jesus didn't even need so many of them. Jesus could have simply done away with it all, done basically everything that he did, come back, heal people, save the world, teach the same things, instead of having to deal with all these guys who are already where they were at in life in those blue-collar trades because it was already decided that they weren't good enough to be religious leaders. He got the undrafted ones, right? He didn't have to do any of this. Or he could have had one. He could have found a really good one. He could have done some miracles and probably stole somebody else's, right? Like he could have begged. He could have done it where that guy had requested a trade, right? And then Jesus would have gotten the perfect disciple, and then that guy would have been left all the rest of it and kind of fixed everything. Instead, he had a bunch of flawed guys, and eventually, follow throughout history, the church is left to all of us. Yeah. Me and you too. Like all of us here in the room, the future of the church. Here we are. You're thinking, God, you could have done better than this, right? It leads to the very reason why God bothered to create us in the first place. God created us in Genesis out of love. God didn't need to make any of us. God just didn't need to, but God did. God created us because God couldn't not create us. God did it out of love. God, who is outside of time and space and inside all of time and space, right? God knew everything that could ever happen. Even with all of our free will, God can know everything that we could ever do and knows everything that we will ever do. And God created the world thinking about you and me. God did it out of love. And it is in that love that we are to demonstrate Christ's love to each other. It's out of that same love that we're created that Jesus embodied for us. Jesus didn't just exist to do some transaction, right? Some of us look at Easter as transactional. Jesus paid the sin for our death. But Jesus paid the price, right? Jesus paid the ransom. Substitutionary penal atonement is what you call that. Not a huge fan. Around here, I'm a bigger fan of what we call Christus Victor, which means that because what penal substitution sets up is that God is mean, God's the jail keeper, and Jesus broke us out. Again, we're getting back into like Top Gun language, right? Instead, our choice to do broken things created brokenness in the world, and that brokenness that exists because we can choose for ourselves leads to sin and death and brokenness and always will. And our choices would always lead us to that. Would always. Anybody who's in here knows that that is indeed where our choices will always lead us eventually. What Christus Victor talks about, and this is a very Lutheran thing, don't worry, it's that Jesus defeated the power of sin and death, defeated the authority of our own broken choices. God showed up and died so that the broken consequences of our choices cannot hold God. We chose brokenness, and God gave God's self for us, and therefore all of that stuff, all of that brokenness has no power anymore. The only thing that could defeat that sort of death, that sort of brokenness, is Jesus. But that's not the only reason why God came. God also showed up, and in the meantime of doing all of that, demonstrated to all of us how we ourselves are supposed to show up every day. Showed us the best way to live. And how did Jesus live? Okay, if we're looking at Jesus in this perspective, what did Jesus do? He lived with a community of people. So it should be with us as well. And maybe you're thinking, okay, that's a bunch of relational garbage for some certain type of guy. No, the word for love here that Jesus uses frequently and that is used in Scripture for Jesus towards friends, towards his disciples, and towards humanity is agape. It's not philia, which is like friendship love. It's not a lot of these other Greek words that you can have for love. The word is self-sacrificial love that has somebody's back no matter what. That kind of friend. Friends, we've had traumatic, not a word. Friends, we've had traumatic medical circumstances in my house, and I have had friends show up and clean my house while we were in the hospital so that we didn't have to come home and see and be reminded of what happened. That's self-sacrificial love. I've had friends that would drop anything in a heartbeat just because I need it. And I have friends that I would do that for as well. That's what we're talking about. Well, that's nice to say, but I don't need that, right? Because I'm careful. I'm not going to hurt myself, so I'm self-sufficient, you say. I've heard stories here at Men of Hope where somebody had an emergency surgery and didn't have family in town, and so they couldn't drive home. Who took them home? Their small group, right? They had guys they could call. Those guys showed up and made sure they were okay. That's what we're talking about. This is why we can live in community. Well, I don't need to. No, but you can. And that's the way that we were designed to live. The goal isn't to barely get by in life, right? Maybe your dad's like mine, and that was the message. We don't do enough just to get by. But how many of us are doing that in life with our relationships? Just enough to, it kind of counts. No. What does it look like to have deep friendships? Because that's the way that we were created to have. And it's not just for convenience, like somebody, you have the ride to the airport, etc. God made us to live together in a community of people. Proverbs 27:17, the most popular men's ministry verse because it sounds very metal. Iron sharpens iron is what 27:17 is. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. You're like, yeah, I want to be sharp iron. Yeah, let's do it. We aren't just helped. We are made better by our community. We are made better by the people around us. There's a thing called the law of accelerated returns. Have you heard about this? If a record is broken in almost any area of life, the law of accelerated returns dictates that, and we see this bear out in history, that record that has stood for 100 years will likely get broken in almost half the time. We are made better by the people around us. Eliud Kipchoge ran in perfect circumstances and not an official marathon, but ran under 2-hour marathon. The fastest that science says a human being can possibly run a marathon is 1:57 in like 30 seconds, and he ran it in 1:59 in 50 seconds or something. He ran an almost perfect race in perfect conditions. And people expect that record to be broken within the next couple decades, even though it was thought impossible. Why? Law of accelerated returns. We are made better by the people around us. When you see what is possible around you, when you have somebody calling out the best in you, you also can be pulled into what is ahead of you. That's what the disciples did for each other. It's one of the great things that The Chosen shows, that series that we show a whole bunch around here, but we backed off on it a little bit. But we show that series a lot, and one of the things that it does really well is characterize a lot of these disciples, who are shown at the beginning, rightfully so, very broken. And even though Easter is also maybe not their best moment, or Good Friday, definitely not their best moment, what they do, what it shows is that they are made better by each other as they seek to follow Jesus. That, friends, is what we're doing. May the spiritual discipline thing be something that you don't miss. Especially this one with fellowship. I'm not talking about drinking buddies. I'm talking about having a group of people that you can call out the best in you and talk about God with. Do you have somebody like that? I know that it might sound like I'm preaching to the choir because we're in small groups here. But we could all put on masks and not really let anybody in. Are you really present with your group? I know a lot of you are, and that's great. Maybe the challenge is actually elsewhere. Maybe it's somewhere outside of, this building. Maybe there's someone here, doesn't have to be in your current group, that needs to widen their circle and step into fellowship with other people to find some common ground. Maybe you need to spend time with others in your community doing something that you love. The point is that, both from a spiritual standpoint as well as just life, we need other people. They've done tests on people that are isolated from all human contact, put people in bunkers, and Some people you can pay to do this, like silence retreats and things, but no. They like from an extreme standpoint of like prolonged, like solitude from other human beings. All of those people lose some sort of cognitive function. You have to relate to other peoples to exist. You have to relate to other people to live, to be okay. We are built to live together. So take a step into one of these spiritual disciplines that we've been going through. Maybe this is a great one. And allow this week to be at least one step into relating to who God is in a new way as we seek to be the men that God made us to be. And in so doing, fill us with hope. Amen. Some discussion questions for us in this area. One is, who do you have that knows you? Like, you could answer this with confidence. Who do you feel like that really knows you? Who is that person? It's great if it's your spouse. I would advocate for that. Your spouse should really know you. But I might argue that it also doesn't completely count. Who do you have in your life that you're not married to that really knows you? Number two, who else do you know? Do you really know on a deep level? Who is there somebody in this world that when I ask the question, if they were here this morning, who really knows you? They think of you. Who do you have in your life like that? And three, where is there an opportunity to see somebody this week? To really know somebody, to really get to know somebody. This might look like asking a real question. You know what I mean? You find yourself in a place where relationally, again, a safe atmosphere in which this is an okay thing to ask. You're like, hey, how are things really? Or, hey, you were sick this last week. How was that? What was that like? Oh, hey, I remember hearing that your dad was going through cancer. How are you doing with that? Ask with the intention to listen. What does it look like to give that gift to somebody? Hey, I saw that you ran a race. That's really cool. Is that something you really like doing? Oh my gosh, it could save somebody's life. All right? What are those opportunities? If number one and number two, nobody comes to mind, it's just an indicator, right? Take the steps this week. Get to invest in the relationships that you have. And I'm super, super grateful for you, all of you. We're going to jump into a new series next week. We'll be good to go. Amen? Grace and peace, friends. Go be good to each other. We'll see you next week.